Hello everyone, I'm Rick, and it's great to have you here today. I love sharing stories like this, and I'm excited to take you through another one. Before we dive in, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you, and now, let's begin. July 22nd, 2012. The afternoon sun beat down on Cascade Summit Trail, turning the packed dirt almost white under the relentless heat. David Carson, 17 years old, had been hiking for just over 2 hours when he stopped to adjust his backpack. His friends remember the moment with the kind of clarity that only comes from witnessing something that changes everything. David was smiling just seconds before it happened. He was grinning at something his girlfriend Jessica had said, his face already flushed from the summer heat and the steep climb. Then his hand went to his neck. Not frantically, not with the dramatic panic you'd see in a movie. It was almost casual, the way someone might touch their throat when they feel something odd. But his eyes changed. That's what Brandon noticed first. Brandon Mitchell, David's best friend since middle school, saw how David's blue eyes suddenly widened, not with surprise, but with something primal, something afraid. "David?" Jessica asked, her voice light, still smiling. "You okay?" He didn't answer. His mouth opened, but the only sound that came out was a thin, strained wheeze. His other hand joined the first at his throat, fingers pressing, searching. The healthy color began draining from his face. First the red flush of exertion faded to normal, then to something waxy and pale, then to something worse. By the time his knees buckled, all 4 friends were shouting his name. Brandon dropped his water bottle and grabbed David's shoulders. "What's wrong? What happened?" But David couldn't speak, could only stare back with eyes that seemed to be looking past Brandon, past everything, to some point beyond. His lips were turning blue. Not the blue you imagine, but real blue. A dusky, terrible shade that would appear in Brandon's nightmares for years to come. Jessica fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. No signal. They were nearly 4 miles into the backcountry, surrounded by steep ridges that blocked any hope of cell service. She started running anyway, her boots pounding against the hard-packed trail, desperate prayers streaming from her lips. The other 2 friends, Marcus Webb and Emma Hayes, tried everything they'd half-remembered from health class years ago. The Heimlich maneuver, back blows, tilting his head back to open his airway. Nothing worked. David's body seemed to fight against them, convulsing, his hand still clutching at his throat, as if he could manually force open an airway that had somehow, impossibly, closed. It took Jessica 19 minutes to reach an area with cell service. Another 37 minutes for the emergency responders to navigate the remote section of trail. By then, David Carson was already gone. The forest had fallen quiet around his body, the afternoon sun still beating down as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. 4 teenagers sat in stunned silence, their hands still shaking, their minds unable to process what they'd just witnessed, unable to comprehend how their friend could be smiling one moment and dead the next. The Pierce County Medical Examiner's Office received David Carson's body on July 23, 2012. Dr. Catherine Walsh had been with the county for 16 years, long enough to have seen most types of death, but not so long that the death of a healthy teenager didn't still shake her. The preliminary examination seemed straightforward enough. David was a healthy 17-year-old with no history of severe allergies, no asthma, no underlying medical conditions that would explain sudden respiratory failure. But his friends had all described the same sequence. A young man who'd suddenly been unable to breathe, who'd clutched at his throat in obvious distress, who'd died from what appeared to be complete airway obstruction. Dr. Walsh's initial theory was simple and logical. Foreign body obstruction. It happened, especially with young people eating while hiking, perhaps swallowing wrong while laughing or talking. But when she performed the full autopsy, examining David's airway from the larynx down through the bronchi, she found nothing. No food particles, no insects, no tissue swelling to suggest anaphylactic shock. The airway tissue showed signs of trauma consistent with desperate, labored breathing, but there was no obvious cause for the obstruction itself. The X-rays revealed no abnormalities that stood out. The visual examination yielded nothing remarkable. Sudden airway obstruction of unknown etiology, Dr. Walsh wrote in her final report. It was the most honest conclusion she could reach, but honesty didn't make it any less frustrating. There had to be a reason. There was always a reason. She just couldn't find it. The police investigation proceeded with the methodical routine of small-town tragedy. 4 teenagers were interviewed separately, their stories documented in careful detail, their timelines examined and cross-referenced. Brandon Mitchell, David's best friend since they'd met in 6th grade, could barely speak through his tears during his interview. Jessica Palmer, David's girlfriend of nearly a year, sat hollow-eyed and mostly silent, answering questions in a flat monotone. Marcus Webb and Emma Hayes gave nearly identical accounts, their stories lining up with uncomfortable precision. They'd been hiking. David had been perfectly fine. Then he wasn't. Then he was dead. Detective Rebecca Foster, who'd known David's father from the local business community, searched for inconsistencies that simply weren't there. Had any of them brought drugs on the hike? No. Had there been any arguments? No. Had David eaten or drunk anything unusual? Just trail mix, energy bars, and water from his own bottle. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would explain this. But the interviews did reveal something else. Something that sat uncomfortably in Detective Foster's notes, even though she couldn't quite articulate why it seemed significant. The friend group had been tight, but there were underlying tensions. Brandon and David had apparently been in some kind of disagreement in the weeks leading up to the hike. Something about Jessica, maybe, or about college applications. Marcus and Emma had been dating, but there was awkwardness there too. Jessica had only really become part of the group that past spring. These were normal teenage dynamics, though, the kind of social friction that existed in every friend group. They didn't explain a death. The toxicology report came back completely clean. No drugs, no alcohol, no toxins or poisons. David's stomach contents confirmed what the friends had reported. Trail mix, an energy bar, water. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would cause sudden respiratory failure. Sometimes, Dr. Walsh told David's parents in her office 4 weeks after their son's death, we simply don't find a clear answer. The human body can fail in ways we don't fully understand, even with all our modern technology. I believe David experienced a sudden catastrophic obstruction of his airway, but I cannot tell you definitively what caused it. I'm deeply sorry. David's mother, Patricia Carson, sat very still in her chair. Her husband Robert held her hand. He was smiling, Patricia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica said he was smiling right before it happened. People don't just stop breathing for no reason. Dr. Walsh had no adequate response to that, because Patricia Carson was absolutely right. People don't just stop breathing for no reason. But sometimes, despite every tool and technique and years of training, medical examiners couldn't identify that reason. It happened. Not often, but it happened. The case was officially closed. David Carson's death certificate listed sudden airway obstruction as the cause of death, with the etiology listed as undetermined. The file was archived, the investigation ended. But the questions didn't. Patricia Carson couldn't let it go. In the months that followed David's death, she became consumed by the details, reading and rereading the police reports, the medical examiner's findings, the transcripts of the interviews with David's friends. Her husband Robert tried to move forward, tried to process their overwhelming grief through therapy and support groups, but Patricia remained fixated. There has to be something they missed, she'd say, sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, papers spread before her like pieces of an impossible puzzle. People don't just die like that, not healthy 17-year-old boys, not for no reason. The friend group fractured in the aftermath. Brandon transferred to a different school district before senior year even started, unable to walk the same hallways where he and David had joked and laughed just months before. Jessica graduated a semester early and left for a college on the East Coast, desperate to escape the memories. Marcus and Emma broke up that fall, their relationship another casualty of that terrible afternoon. By David's first death anniversary, The 4 people who'd been with him on Cascade Summit Trail had scattered across the country, united only by trauma they rarely spoke about with anyone, even each other. Brandon tried therapy. It helped somewhat, gave him tools to manage the overwhelming guilt and grief, but nightmares still plagued him for years. Dreams where he could save David if he just acted faster, pressed harder during CPR, tilted his head at exactly the right angle, did something, anything more. He'd wake up gasping for air, his own hands at his throat, his heart pounding. Jessica couldn't hike anymore, couldn't even look at forest trails or mountain paths without feeling her pulse quicken, without remembering the desperate sprint down that trail, the way her lungs had burned, the crushing knowledge that she hadn't been fast enough to save him. Years passed. 5 years? 8 years? 10 years. David's room in the Carson house remained largely unchanged, a shrine that Patricia couldn't quite bring herself to dismantle, even as Robert gently suggested that it might be time, that holding on so tightly might be preventing them from healing. David's high school graduation photo stayed on the mantel. His soccer trophies and academic awards lined the hallway. Time moved inexorably forward for everyone else, but a piece of the Carson family remained frozen in July 2012. Patricia Carson attended conferences about unexplained deaths in young adults. She joined online support groups for families seeking answers about mysterious medical cases. She learned more about forensic pathology and autopsy procedures than any grieving mother should ever have to learn. And always, she returned to the same fundamental question. What did they miss? What piece of the puzzle was still hidden? In the spring of 2021, she wrote another letter to the medical examiner's office. It was one of dozens she'd sent over the years, each one politely requesting a review of David's case, each one carefully laying out why she believed something had been overlooked. Each previous letter had received a polite response explaining that without new evidence or new information, there was nothing more that could be examined. The case was closed. This letter received a similar initial response. But this time, something different happened. The new chief medical examiner, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, had a reputation for thoroughness that some colleagues described as obsessive. He'd taken the position in Pierce County 8 months earlier, relocating from Boston specifically because he wanted to focus on cold cases and unexplained deaths. The high-pressure, high-profile work of big city forensics had burned him out. He wanted time to think deeply about cases, to really dig into the mysteries that haunted families and investigators for years or even decades. When Patricia Carson's letter crossed his desk, Dr. Rodriguez did what he always did with such requests. He pulled the original case file, and when he read through Dr. Walsh's thorough 2012 report, something caught his attention. Not anything that was obviously wrong or mistaken, just a nagging sense that in 2012 they'd been limited by the technology available at the time. Dr. Rodriguez had spent the past decade watching forensic technology evolve at an almost staggering pace. What had seemed impossible to detect in 2012 was now visible with a clarity that would have seemed like science fiction just 10 years earlier. CT scanners had advanced dramatically. Digital imaging had improved by orders of magnitude, and most importantly, AI-assisted analysis could now identify tiny anomalies that human eyes might miss even when looking at thousands of cross-sectional images. On a cold morning in February 2023, Dr. Rodriguez made a call to the evidence storage facility. David Carson's body had been cremated years ago, of course, but tissue samples remained, carefully preserved according to standard protocol for any unexplained death. More importantly, the original X-rays and examination photographs were still on file, stored digitally. Modern software could reprocess old X-ray data using advanced algorithms to pull out details that 2012 technology had either blurred or rendered functionally invisible. It was a long shot, Dr. Rodriguez knew that. But Patricia Carson's letter had struck a chord with him. The case file showed a perfectly healthy teenager who died from airway obstruction with no identifiable cause. In Dr. Rodriguez's considerable experience, That combination was vanishingly rare. There was always a cause, always. Medical examiners just hadn't found it yet. The reprocessed imaging took 4 days to complete. Dr. Rodriguez reviewed the results in his office on a Friday evening, the building quiet around him, his coffee long since gone cold. He almost missed it on his first pass through the images. A tiny density in the soft tissue of the upper neck, so small it looked like it could easily be an artifact of the imaging process itself, just a digital glitch or shadow. But it wasn't an artifact. The AI analysis flagged it with 89% certainty. Foreign metallic object approximately 8 millimeters in length, lodged in the soft tissue lateral to the trachea just below the thyroid cartilage. The original 2012 X-rays had actually captured it, but at the resolution available at the time, and given its location near bony structures, it had been functionally invisible. Just a slightly denser shadow in tissue that was already difficult to image clearly with the technology of the era. Dr. Rodriguez leaned closer to his computer screen, his heart rate picking up. The object had a distinct shape visible in the enhanced imaging. Not organic, not irregular like food particles or biological matter. It was linear, manufactured, something that absolutely did not belong inside a human body. He pulled the preserved tissue samples next. David's throat tissue had been carefully sectioned and stored, standard practice for any unexplained death. Under high-powered magnification, using microscopy techniques that had advanced significantly since 2012, Dr. Rodriguez could see what Dr. Walsh had missed. Not through any fault of her own, but simply because the technology hadn't existed yet. There was a tract of compressed, damaged tissue, a pathway where something had penetrated deeply into the soft structures of the neck. And when he carefully dissected the preserved tissue using microsurgical techniques that hadn't been available in 2012, he found it. A small, thin piece of metal, sharply pointed at one end, broken or fractured at the other end. Dr. Rodriguez sat back in his chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. This changed everything. This wasn't sudden airway obstruction of unknown cause. This was a foreign body that had been missed, that had killed a teenager while doctors and investigators searched desperately for an answer that had been there all along, just too small to see. But the discovery raised an even more troubling question. How does a small piece of sharp metal end up lodged that deeply in someone's neck? Not by accident, not by swallowing something wrong or having food go down the wrong pipe. The location was too specific, the angle of penetration too precise. The metal fragment had entered from the lateral aspect of the neck, penetrating inward. This wasn't something David had swallowed. This was something that had entered his body from the outside. This was penetrating trauma. And that meant this might not have been an accident at all. The metal fragment measured 8.3 millimeters in length and roughly 1.2 millimeters in diameter. Under high magnification, Dr. Rodriguez could see it was made of aluminum alloy, with one end showing a clean, machined edge, and the other end showing clear signs of fracture, as if it had broken off from something larger. He photographed it from every possible angle, documented its exact original position in David's tissue with painstaking precision, and sent samples for materials analysis. The results came back within 5 days. Aluminum alloy consistent with manufacturing from the mid-2000s to early 2010s. The composition and machining marks were consistent with mass-produced consumer items, particularly small tools, keychains, tactical pens, and similar everyday carry items, popular among outdoor enthusiasts and young adults interested in self-defense or survival gear. But what specific item was it part of? Dr. Rodriguez sent high-resolution photographs to a materials expert at the University of Washington who specialized in manufactured metal products. The expert spent a week consulting databases, product specifications, and manufacturing records. The answer, when it came, was both simple and deeply troubling. The fragment was consistent with the pointed tip of a tactical keychain, sometimes called a kubotan. These were small metal rods typically 3 to 5 inches long, designed ostensibly for self-defense or as emergency glass-breaking tools. They were legal, widely available online and in sporting goods stores, and popular among teenagers and college students, particularly those interested in everyday carry gear or personal safety. The pointed tip served as both a pressure point tool and, theoretically, a last-resort defensive weapon. The broken end of the fragment showed signs of significant force. This hadn't simply fallen off through normal wear and tear. The metal had been stressed to its breaking point, likely through impact with something hard, perhaps bone or cartilage. Dr. Rodriguez carefully reconstructed what must have happened. At some point during that hike on July 22, 2012, this sharp-ended metal tip had entered David Carson's neck. Not accidentally. The angle of entry was wrong for an accident. The depth of penetration was too significant, the location too specific. Someone, or something, had driven it into the soft tissue of David's neck, where it had lodged, invisible, on the 2012 X-rays, too small to be felt during the external examination. The tip had penetrated near small blood vessels and had caused internal bleeding. The blood had pooled in the tissue, forming a hematoma that had gradually expanded over the course of 20 to 40 minutes, slowly compressing David's trachea from the outside. He hadn't choked on food or suffered an allergic reaction. He'd been dying from internal trauma that nobody could see, that nobody understood was happening until it was far too late. The implications were staggering. Dr. Rodriguez reached for his phone to call Detective Foster, who was still with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, now a senior detective. Then he hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. Before alerting law enforcement and potentially turning this into a criminal investigation, he needed to understand something crucial. How exactly does this happen? He spent the entire weekend reviewing the original timeline, reading and rereading the witness statements from 2012. The autopsy had been performed within 24 hours of death. The metal fragment would have been present in David's body then, but Dr. Walsh's examination in 2012 had reasonably focused on looking for food obstruction, allergic reactions, or biological causes of airway failure. A tiny piece of aluminum lodged in soft tissue would have been nearly impossible to spot with the naked eye during a standard external and internal examination, especially without any reason to suspect penetrating trauma from the outside. But that didn't answer the central, troubling question. David had been hiking with 4 close friends. No one had mentioned anything about a keychain or any kind of tool or weapon. No one had described seeing him handle anything except water bottles, energy bars, and trail mix. No one had reported seeing anything go into or near his throat, which meant one of several possibilities. It had happened during a moment when no one was looking directly at David. It had happened, and someone had deliberately concealed what they'd witnessed. Or someone was lying about what they'd seen and knew. Dr. Rodriguez pulled up the original police interviews on his computer screen. He read them slowly this time, methodically, looking not just for what they said but for what they didn't say, for the spaces between the words, for the details that might have seemed irrelevant in 2012 but could be crucial now. Brandon Mitchell had been David's best friend. He'd been standing closest to David when he'd first started showing distress. His interview transcript was emotional, sometimes rambling, filled with expressions of guilt and grief. Jessica Palmer had been approximately 6 feet behind David on the trail when it happened. She'd run for help, been gone for nearly 20 minutes. Marcus Webb and Emma Hayes had been together, slightly behind the main group, when they'd heard Brandon shouting. 4 teenagers, all supposedly with clear lines of sight to each other on a mountain trail, all claiming to have seen nothing unusual happen, all describing the same sequence of events. David had been fine one moment, dying the next, with no explanation. But now Dr. Rodriguez knew there had to have been an unusual moment, a specific moment when a metal fragment from a tactical keychain had entered David's throat with enough force to penetrate deeply and break off inside. A moment that had changed everything. Someone knew what that moment was. Someone had been lying, or at least not telling the complete truth, for 11 years. Detective Rebecca Foster was 43 years old now, a senior detective with Pierce County. And when Dr. Rodriguez called her on a Monday morning in March 2023, she remembered the Carson case immediately. Her voice on the phone was cautious but interested. "That teenager who died on the trail," she said, "back in 2012. I've always felt like we missed something in that investigation. Tell me you found it." Dr. Rodriguez told her everything. The reprocessed imaging, the metal fragment, the likely source, the implications that this might not have been a simple medical mystery, but rather some kind of trauma, possibly inflicted by another person. Foster was silent for a long moment after he finished. "That changes everything," she said finally, her voice harder now, more focused. "That potentially makes this a homicide investigation. But here's what I remember from 2012. Those 4 kids, their stories were almost too synchronized, too perfectly aligned. At the time, I thought it meant they were all telling the truth, that they'd all witnessed the same events. Now I'm wondering if it means they coordinated their stories, if they decided together what to say and what not to say." The case was officially reopened the following week. 11 years had passed, but all 4 witnesses were still alive, still reachable. Brandon Mitchell was 28 years old now, working as a software developer in Seattle. Jessica Palmer was an elementary school teacher in Boston. Marcus Webb managed a sporting goods store in Portland. Emma Hayes was completing a graduate degree in psychology at Berkeley. Detective Foster made the initial contact calls herself. She was deliberately vague about the reason, careful not to reveal what Dr. Rodriguez had discovered. "We're reviewing several old cases using new forensic techniques," she explained to each of them in turn. "Advanced imaging technology. We'd like to conduct follow-up interviews with witnesses from those cases. You're not in any trouble. We're just trying to get the most complete information possible now that we have new capabilities." The reactions were immediately telling, even over the phone. Brandon agreed to an interview almost instantly, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I've never stopped thinking about that day," he told Foster, the words tumbling out quickly. "Not for a single week in 11 years. If there's new information about what happened to David, I need to know. I have to know." Jessica's response was similar in its immediacy, obvious distress in her voice, but something else underneath too. A note of fear, perhaps, or resignation. She agreed to fly back to Washington for the interview. Marcus hesitated noticeably before agreeing. "After 11 years, he said slowly, what could possibly be new? What could advanced imaging tell you that the autopsy didn't?" It was a reasonable question, but his tone suggested he was worried about the answer. He agreed to the interview but requested that his attorney be present. Certainly his legal right, but an interesting choice given the supposedly straightforward nature of the request. Emma was the one who broke. Detective Foster had barely finished her careful explanation when Emma started crying on the phone. The words came out between sobs. "I knew this would happen eventually. I knew it. We couldn't keep it hidden forever. I've been waiting for this call for 11 years. And just like that, after more than a decade of silence, the dam broke." The truth came out in pieces over the following weeks, each person's interview filling in different sections of a story that had been deliberately obscured for over a decade. But it was Emma, weighted down by years of guilt and the psychological burden of keeping such a terrible secret, who provided the most complete narrative. It had started 3 weeks before the fatal hike. David and Brandon had gotten into an argument, something that seemed stupid and teenage in retrospect, the kind of conflict that should have blown over in a few days. But it hadn't. David had started dating Jessica that spring, and she and Brandon had apparently been friends first. There was tension there, unspoken feelings that Brandon had never quite articulated, but that everyone in the group could sense. When Jessica had chosen David, Brandon had claimed to be fine with it, had insisted it didn't bother him, but it clearly had. Then there'd been another issue. Brandon had apparently confided something personal to David, something about his family situation, and David had mentioned it casually to others in the group. Brandon had felt betrayed, had accused David of violating his trust. David had apologized, had insisted it had been an innocent mistake, but the damage to their friendship had been done. By the time the group had planned the Cascade Summit hike, tensions were running high, but they'd all agreed to go anyway. One last summer adventure together before everything potentially fell apart, before they all went off to different colleges and different lives. Brandon had brought a tactical keychain on the hike, a small aluminum rod with a pointed tip, the kind marketed for self-defense and emergency situations. His father had given it to him as a graduation gift, along with some other outdoor gear. Brandon had developed a habit of fidgeting with it when he was anxious or stressed, clicking it against his thumb, rolling it between his fingers. During the hike, as the group had made their way up the trail in the July heat, Brandon had been doing exactly that, fidgeting with the keychain. And David had noticed, had made a comment about it, something dismissive, maybe mocking. "Still playing with your little safety blanket, Brandon?" they'd argued. Not loudly, not dramatically enough to alarm the others at first, but with enough edge that Jessica, Marcus, and Emma had all noticed the tension rising. The argument had been about nothing specific and everything at once. About trust, about friendship, about Jessica, about respect. At some point during that argument, as they'd stopped on the trail to rest and drink water, Brandon had been gesturing with the keychain still in his hand, using it to punctuate his points. What happened next occurred in a span of maybe 2 or 3 seconds. The kind of moment where motion and intention and accident all blur together, where afterwards everyone involved struggles to say exactly what they saw or what anyone really meant to do. Brandon had been pointing with the keychain, making some argument, his voice rising. David had laughed. Not a kind laugh, not an attempt to diffuse the situation, but a dismissive, almost mocking sound. And he'd turned away, as if Brandon wasn't even worth listening to anymore. Brandon had reached out and grabbed David's shoulder, trying to turn him back around, trying to make him listen. The keychain was still in his hand. David had jerked his shoulder away, hard, pulling away from Brandon's grip. And in that moment of movement, of anger and momentum and terrible timing, Brandon's hand with the keychain had made contact with the side of David's neck. Not a deliberate stab, not an intentional attack, but the pointed aluminum tip had met soft tissue at exactly the wrong angle, with exactly the wrong amount of force, and it had penetrated. The tip had slipped into David's neck like something inevitable, pushing past skin and muscle, lodging deep in the soft tissue near his trachea. And the impact had been just forceful enough that the tip had broken off, the cheap aluminum fracturing under stress, leaving the fragment behind. David's immediate reaction, his hand going to his neck, the look of confusion, and then dawning fear, hadn't registered with anyone as being connected to Brandon's grab. Not right away. Brandon had pulled his hand back, looking at the keychain in his grip with dawning horror as he realized the tip was gone. David had taken maybe 3 or 4 steps before the reality of what was happening began to become clear. His throat had felt wrong, tight, painful, and then everything had happened at once, chaos unfolding rapidly. David couldn't breathe properly. His friends had surrounded him, panicked, trying desperately to help, and Brandon had stood there, frozen, the broken keychain in his hand, understanding slowly crystallizing into horror. In the chaos, as David had collapsed, and everyone had been focused on trying to save him, Brandon had hidden the keychain. Just thrown it into the dense brush beside the trail, his hand moving almost on instinct. In his interview 11 years later, with his own attorney present, Brandon claimed it had been pure instinct, not calculation. He'd been terrified, confused, his mind unable to process what was happening. The keychain had been in his hand one moment, then David couldn't breathe. But surely one thing hadn't caused the other, surely it was just a terrible coincidence. But as the minutes had dragged on, as David had continued to deteriorate despite all their desperate efforts to help, as his skin had turned that terrible blue color and his eyes had gone unfocused, Brandon's shock and confusion had hardened into something else. Self-preservation, fear. He hadn't meant to hurt David. It had been an accident, a terrible confluence of events, anger and bad timing, and a sharp object in exactly the wrong place at the wrong moment. But would anyone believe that? Would the police understand the difference between intentional harm and a moment of frustration that had gone catastrophically wrong? By the time Jessica had returned with paramedics, by the time David had been officially pronounced dead on that trail, Brandon had convinced himself that saying nothing was the only option. And he'd convinced Marcus and Emma to say nothing as well. They'd been too traumatized, too shocked to think clearly or resist. Everything had happened so fast, had been so terrible and surreal, that going along with Brandon's desperate plea to just not mention the argument or the keychain had seemed almost reasonable in the moment. Sarah, arriving back at the scene with emergency services, had known only what she'd seen. David alive and fine when she'd left, dying when she'd returned. The pact of silence had been implicit at first, unspoken. Then, as the police investigation had proceeded, it had become more explicit. They'd agreed on a simple story. David had been fine, laughing and hiking with them. Then suddenly he wasn't fine. He couldn't breathe. They didn't know why. It had been a tragic, unexplainable accident. No arguments, no conflicts, nothing unusual at all. They'd convinced themselves in their grief and trauma that they were protecting Brandon from an unjust accusation. That what had happened truly had been an accident that no one could have prevented or predicted. That mentioning it would only cause more pain for everyone, especially David's family. But guilt works differently on different people. Brandon had tried to move on with his life, had gone to college and built a career, but he'd carried the weight of that day like stones. Every achievement felt hollow. Every happy moment was shadowed by the memory of David's face, by the knowledge of what he'd done and then hidden. Marcus had dealt with it by trying not to think about it at all, by building his life around the decision that the past was past and couldn't be changed. Emma had studied psychology in graduate school in large part to try to understand her own moral compromise, her own complicity in the cover-up. "I'm so sorry," Emma told Detective Foster through tears during her interview in April 2023. "I was 18 years old. I was terrified. I thought I was protecting my friend, protecting Brandon from something that wasn't his fault. But I should have protected David's family. They deserve to know the truth. They spent 11 years not knowing, and that's because of me, because of all of us." Marcus corroborated Emma's story in his own interview, though with less emotion and more resignation. "I knew something felt wrong about lying," he said, his voice flat. "But Brandon swore it was an accident, swore the keychain couldn't have actually caused what happened to David. And we were kids who'd watched our best friend die in front of us. We weren't thinking clearly about right and wrong. We were just trying to survive it." Brandon's interview, conducted with his attorney carefully monitoring every question, was different in tone. He maintained that what had happened had been completely unintentional. "I grabbed his shoulder because I wanted him to listen to me, to take me seriously. I didn't even remember the keychain was in my hand. If that metal piece came from my keychain, I had no idea it had broken, no idea it had entered his skin. David's death was a tragedy. The worst thing that's ever happened to me, but it wasn't murder. It wasn't even assault. It was a horrible, horrible accident." Legally, the district attorney's office faced a genuinely complex situation. What Brandon had done, assuming Emma and Marcus's testimony was accurate, appeared to be unintentional. Manslaughter at the very worst, possibly just a tragic accident that wouldn't rise to the level of criminal culpability at all. Proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt, 11 years after the fact, based on reconstructed testimony from traumatized teenagers, would be nearly impossible. But proving that he'd obstructed justice, that all of them had conspired to hide evidence and mislead investigators, that was far more straightforward. The interviews provided clear evidence of deliberate concealment, Brandon's admission to hiding the keychain, their coordinated stories that had omitted crucial information. These formed a much clearer case of obstruction. In the end, after months of legal negotiations, Brandon Mitchell pled guilty to obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. He received a suspended sentence with 3 years of probation and community service. The judge, while noting the seriousness of the cover-up, also acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances and Brandon's genuine remorse. Marcus Webb and Emma Hayes received immunity from prosecution in exchange for their complete and truthful testimony. Jessica Palmer was never charged with anything. She'd known nothing about the keychain incident, had been absent during the critical moments, and had told the truth as she'd understood it. But the legal resolution was almost secondary to the emotional one. Patricia Carson learned the truth in Dr. Rodriguez's office on a warm afternoon in May 2023. She'd spent 11 years demanding answers, refusing to accept that her son's death was simply unexplainable. And when the answers finally came, they were both a relief and a devastation. "He didn't just die," she said quietly, her voice steady but her eyes wet with tears. "Someone hurt him. Even if it was an accident, someone hurt him and then hid it from us." Based on all the evidence, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully, it appears to have been an unintentional injury during a confrontation, a terrible, preventable accident that was then covered up. Patricia shook her head slowly. "But we could have known. We could have known 11 years ago if they'd just told the truth. If they'd just been honest about what happened." There was no adequate response to that because she was absolutely right. Robert Carson, more pragmatic than his wife, but grieving no less deeply, had a slightly different reaction. "At least now we know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "At least we're not still wondering. At least David's death means something now. Maybe it'll make someone else think twice before hiding the truth." David's case became a teaching example in forensic pathology programs across the country. How small details could be missed even in thorough examinations. How technology evolved and opened new possibilities for solving old mysteries. How the truth could hide in microscopic spaces, waiting for the right tools and the right eyes to find it. Dr. Rodriguez published a detailed paper on the case, and medical examiners nationwide began reviewing their own unexplained airway obstruction cases with renewed scrutiny and new imaging techniques. Brandon Mitchell finally entered therapy specifically focused on his guilt and trauma, not just from witnessing David's death, but from being the cause of it, however, unintentionally, and from being complicit in hiding the truth for over a decade. "I told myself for years that I was protecting myself and the others," he said, in a victim impact statement read at his sentencing. "But really, I was just running from the truth, from what I'd done. I can't ever make this right. I can't bring David back. But maybe being honest now is something. It's all I have left to give." Emma Hayes's graduate research took on new focus after the truth came out. She began studying the psychology of group silence, how trauma and loyalty and fear combine to enable cover-ups, even among fundamentally good people who wouldn't normally see themselves as capable of such prolonged deception. How the human mind rationalized and compartmentalized to protect itself from unbearable guilt. Brandon maintained that he'd never intended any harm, that the keychain contacting David's neck had been pure accident. His friends were divided on that question, but from a legal standpoint, the question was genuinely complex. Intent matters in criminal law. Mens rea, the guilty mind, is foundational to determining culpability. Had Brandon intended to harm David? Almost certainly not. Had his momentary anger, combined with terrible luck and poor judgment, resulted in death? Yes, undeniably. Was his subsequent cover-up criminal? Absolutely. But Patricia Carson, sitting in her living room 11 years and 10 months after her son's death, wasn't particularly interested in legal nuances or debates about intent. She had the answer she'd spent over a decade seeking. It didn't bring David back. It didn't ease the ache of his absence or fill the David-shaped hole in her life. But it gave her something she hadn't had before. Closure. The truth. "I knew there was something wrong," she told a journalist writing about the case resolution. "A mother knows. I just wish I could have proven it sooner. I wish they'd been brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered." The journalist asked if she had any message for the 4 witnesses, particularly for Brandon. Patricia considered the question carefully for a long moment. "I hope they can live with what they did," she said finally, her voice firm. "I hope the weight of it stays with them, because I think about my son every single day, and I always will. That's what they took from us by lying. Not just David. They took 11 years of knowing the truth." On a Saturday morning in June 2023, Jessica Palmer flew back to Washington and drove out to Cascade Summit Trail for the first time since July 22, 2012. She hiked alone, slowly, until she reached the spot where she remembered David collapsing all those years ago. It looked almost exactly the same. The same trees, the same packed dirt trail, the same filtered sunlight through the canopy. She stood there for a long time, thinking about how much had changed and how much hadn't. How truth had a way of emerging eventually, no matter how deeply buried or how long concealed. How the things we think we're hiding often end up hiding us instead, trapping us in our own deceptions. She didn't pray. She'd lost that habit somewhere in the years since David's death, somewhere between guilt and grief and trying to build a new life. But she spoke to him anyway, out loud to the silent forest, an apology and a promise. That she'd tell her students about truth, about courage, about the terrible weight of silence. That David's death, tragic and preventable as it had been, would mean something. Then she walked back down the trail into the summer morning, carrying what she'd always carried, but understanding it differently now. Understanding that some debts can never be fully repaid, some mistakes never fully corrected. But that truth, even when it comes late, still matters. Behind her, the forest remained as it had been, timeless and patient, keeping whatever other secrets might lie buried in its shadows, waiting for someone to finally bring them into the light.